you can see that even the targets that we have put forth are not sufficient to meet the 1.5 degree targets. So what do we see in the energy transition? We really see a world of electricity growth. What you can see is, we have our inflections case, our green rules case, our discord case. Perhaps not appropriately labeled, but the green line on top is oil use. The blue line right below that is electricity use, and this is all put in energy equivalent terms. And below that, you can see natural gas, coal, nuclear is captured another. There are major differences. These scenarios, we see all of them as plausible. And on a regular basis, we track and see. We're going to do a major update in 2 months. We track and see what this, whether we think we have to rethink whether we are on an inflections pathway, whether we're on a discord pathway, whether we're on a green rules pathway. And the differences really are the most dramatic for, let's say, for electricity. They're dramatic for oil. And for natural gas, it's actually much less of a differentiator. But regardless of the scenarios, you can see some commonalities. We are going to see a growth in electricity like we've never seen before. And this comes through the electrification of a lot of the energy needs and a lot of the energy processes. And when we think about the future of electricity, it is renewables. We really do see wind and solar taking off in a way that very few energy sources ever have historically. And even in our discord scenario, even in the scenario where technology doesn't disseminate, where there's industrial protectionism, where there's nationalism, this is still a case where renewables are still growing rapidly. Our reference case shows in terms of terawatt hours how much that growth we're seeing, and this is going out through 2050. To meet this growth, this is a massive level of investments. So this gives you a sense of the amount of financing that's needed. Gives you a sense of the amount of investments that's taking place. When you think about renewables, this is really capital. That this isn't variable cost. This isn't fuel on a regular basis that then gets, this is capital that gets in, and to use a standard phrase, this is steel in the ground, or panels on a rooftop, or windmills in the ocean. And in terms of where that's happening, this is very much a China story, very much a Europe story, very much a North America story. This is maybe one of the controversies when it comes to global climate talks, is that a lot of the investment around the energy transition is in fact happening in the developed world, even as regions like Africa in particular, poorer parts of Asia that are not, first of all, not energy rich and have a population that has perhaps in certain cases 1/100th that of energy consumption per GDP. They're not seeing this investment. This is part of the conflict. So kind of digging into some of the specific topic areas, we look at stationary energy storage. This is essentially the grid storage, the batteries that support these renewables. We just showed how renewables are really going to be taking off in a way they've never taken off before. Well, those are all intermittent renewables, and solar, as we know, is going to be limited. Solar production is going to be limited to the hours that the sunlight is up. Wind production is also not similarly, but it's also intermittent. All of this needs backup, and so what we're seeing is really these energy storage additions. This is happening on the stationary side. You can see we've kind of hit the launch point and if you look at the chart, 2022, 2023, 2024, massive growth, and it's going to continue to grow. Again, if you look at where that's happening, we're looking at the United States, we're looking at China, and in particular, when we're thinking about the United States and the IRA, there are very specific prescriptions around these technologies and how they can be rewarded. Wanted to touch upon hydrogen, and again, you can see the same construct here. We have our history, we have our inflections case, we have our green rules case, we have our discord case, and you can also see where we expect these to be taking place. The key thing here is that unlike renewables and storage, which are really taking off now, the hydrogen story is one that has to still be building up. We're still looking at the policies being put in place. This is in the US, in terms of Europe with their auctions, in Asia, and particularly in Japan and in Korea. The policies are being put in place. The launch point for hydrogen is not going to be this next decade. We expect it to be the decade after that. But as you can see, the variability in our scenarios, remember that our inflections, our green rules, and discord scenarios, we all see them as plausible scenarios. Inflections is our base case, but the other two are certainly ones that we consider with varying realms of possibility. And in a discord case where you don't have that technology sharing, where you don't have that sort of ability to trade, where you don't have the GDP growth, we don't expect hydrogen to be taking off in that world. So if you think about all the associated demands that come with a hydrogen uptake, those wouldn't happen in a discord world. They certainly would happen less in an inflections world. And they, obviously a green rules world where there's cooperation, technology transfer, and strong policy support, that wouldn't be a problem. So for hydrogen, and particularly for the metals needs behind hydrogen, the issue is which of the hydrogen types are going to be the ones that are supported. We do expect traditional gray hydrogen maintaining its market share. As I said, going out through 2030, we don't see that much happening in terms of total hydrogen generation by type. What we do see as we go further is that, again, we have a lot of variability, and we see the potential contribution of green hydrogen, which then comes with the demand for iridium and platinum and a lot of other metals. This all happens not this decade, really next decade. And if you think about, if you're looking at the demand for those metals and minerals, you're also looking at, for example, some of the platinums in catalytic converters as you have the electric vehicles take over and less internal combustion engines. In some ways, are you waiting to see for some of this green hydrogen and electrolyzers to kind of perhaps come and save the day when you see some of the lower demand from the internal combustion engines? And that kind of brings me to the transportation sectors. We do also forecast, and we have splits by this. We have splits by sector type, by country type, by fuel type. We do see certain of these technologies, energy transition technologies, next generation technologies being decided. They all come with their own set of needs and their own set of upstream demands. In terms of light duty passenger vehicles, we do see battery electrics as the ultimate winner in the long run. Certainly, there's potential for biofuels to keep to still play a role. With trucks, we're still waiting to see how that plays out. Certainly, batteries can play a role, but we also do look at hydrogen fuel cells. We look at other options. For planes, it's really biofuels and SAF that have played out. And for shipping, it's lower carbon intensity fuels. So each one of these, where it's undecided, this again creates uncertainty in terms of the overall demand for the particular fuels, for the particular technologies. Where it's more decided, it's more of an issue of how quickly do we expect it to happen. And the transition away from oil, we think, is going to be the fastest in the on-road sector. So we're basically, you can see the split here in terms of light-duty vehicles on the left-hand panel, total truck sales on the right-hand panel. This is all in terms of total sales, and this is our outlook. So you can see, gasoline in terms of light-duty vehicles, we are on that downward trend already. This is not something that's forecast. This is something that's happening. The question is, the pace of how quickly that happens in terms of vehicles. And the other question is how much of a hybridization and how much of it is this full battery electric vehicles? How much of this is going to be plug-in hybrids? How much of this is going to be advanced hybrids? And that's kind of where, if you look at the pink and the orange and the magenta, I guess, on the left-hand panel, this is where the uncertainties lie. We do see in the heavy-duty space, this is where there is more uncertainty. We mentioned that we think the technology is not settled. Still, gasoline and particularly diesel is going to remain the fuel of choice. But again, this is the realm where we think things can move if the technology proves itself, if the infrastructure comes into place. Just wanted to put our latest data in terms of EV light duty EV sales. There's a lot of news. There's a lot of information talking about the slowdown. The fact is, this year we're still pretty with the first 3 months of data, and still pretty strongly up year on year. I mean, the fact is there always is a slowdown at the beginning of the year. If you look back at the trends going, January of last year was low, but so far this year we've had, January up year on year, March up significantly year on year. So there certainly is talk of and motivations around the slowdown in electric vehicles. The data is still hasn't really borne that out to such a strong way. And so we are still very bullish in terms of our assumptions on plug-in electric vehicle sales. We do expect them to grow at 23.2%, and maybe the accuracy there is a little, false sense of confidence. But let's just say we do expect strong growth over the next, 5-6 years. You can see where that growth is happening. Certainly, and where that growth is happening is important because there are specific battery chemistries that are associated with each region, which we are tracking. The other point that I had mentioned, and one that I think is worth noting, is the battery electric vehicle share in the PEV sales. That has actually been dropping, which suggests that forms of more aggressive hybrids or plug-in hybrids are gaining traction in the market. And what that means is on a per vehicle basis, the batteries are smaller, the material demands are smaller. So this is a trend we are working. I mentioned in the previous slide kind of how that split is between the pure battery electrics, between the aggressive hybrids and the plug-in hybrids. How that plays out will be an interesting thing for us to keep watching going forward. Again, when we look at a lot of our penetration and our assumptions in terms of electric vehicle penetration, there are policy-driven jurisdictions and there are economics-driven jurisdictions. And when we look at total cost of ownership of vehicles, particularly in places like the US, the relative costs of power, of the batteries, of the vehicles, these all play a role. And obviously, this is something that our pricing team, which the former Platts pricing team, is still following a lot of these prices on a daily basis with price assessments. So our lithium outlook remains strong. I mean, this follows our assumptions about the other sectors. You can see in terms of this is our sense of the balances in terms of supply and in terms of consumption. This growth is strong, and what again this does is this starts placing, This starts drawing attention to the environmental performance of the sector. Again, if this is a sector that's designed as an approach that's going to be helping with the achievement of the 1.5 degree target, then certainly, this is among the major criticisms that you see is that, well, okay, we are eliminating gasoline and diesel, but at the same time, we're going to have higher emissions and more environmental degradation, not just emissions, but also land use, water use, et cetera, that comes from the mining, the refining, the processing perspective. So, when we do the analysis, clearly there's a crossover point where battery electric vehicles are CO2 beneficial, but that attention is certainly coming to the fore. And this is where the thoughts are of, okay, well, you have your conventional, let's say, lithium extraction. So what are some of the new and novel approaches that are emerging? And a lot of these are being driven, in fact, by environmental footprint issues. I mean, some of them are also being driven very much by geopolitics, availability, and regions of the world that just have lithium supply in much lower concentrations, and thus new technologies are needed. But in the case of impacts on landscape, on water usage, on CO2 emissions, there is more attention to it. We have the EU battery regulations, the passport, where essentially there's pressure to disclose and start addressing the CO2 emissions. So among the approaches that we were looking at, everything from mining to clay to geothermal mining to oil field brine extraction, which is was in the news recently with a lot of the fracking liquids that can potentially be monetized, direct lithium extraction, and seawater mining in the more distant future when you start getting to levels of concentration that require a lot more processing. So these are at different stages of development. And when we look forward, we think about, okay, how much pressure will there be on the policy side? Will it drive the uptake? Will the costs of essentially working with lower lithium concentrations be able to be overcome by any incentives that the policymakers put up? And what we end up with is we end up again with scenarios, and in our base case scenarios, we see over 20% of total lithium supply coming from unconventional mining methods by the end of this decade. So there are pressures. There are pressures coming from the environmental side. There are pressures from regions that want to be in this business and can only do so by dealing with lower concentration lithium. At the same time, there's a lot of uncertainties. So we still see uptake of up to 8% in terms of the unconventional extraction, but 8% and over 20% is a big range, and that's something that we recognize and we're tracking. Each one of these technologies faces its own risks. I mean, when we talk about the resource types, some of them have very attractive CO2 characteristics. Some of them have extremely high water usage. Some of them use other chemicals that there are concerns about. And there's concerns about, as you address one set of environmental concerns, are you actually increasing the potential with other environmental concerns? So I'm focusing in on the lithium industry here, but this is, this type of thinking can be extended to a lot of the other mining industries in different forms. This is a report that we specifically focused on lithium. So we looked at the DLE routes, we looked at the clay routes, and we looked at the different resource types. And ultimately, we translated this into a set of assumptions about how much unconventional and what that means for emissions. Recycling, I mentioned earlier, one of the potentially some of the more sustainable approaches can be recycling. And this is true of minerals. This is true of steel. This is true of plastics. This is true of many sort of impactful industries. Now, what are some of the roadblocks, some of the hurdles? There are the cost, because this is, can this be done cheaper than producing virgin material? Part of it can be security of supply issues. Do jurisdictions want to be able to recycle just so they don't have to rely on outside sources? And, I mentioned sustainability. We had done a similar set of analysis and looked at the key battery metals in this case. And what we found is the maximal potential availability of recycled materials accounted for 30% of the nickel, 27% of the lithium, and 40% of the cobalt. This is sensitive to a lot of things. One thing to note is increasing prevalence of LFP battery technologies. You think about the battery chemistries that are involved. The minerals just are not as valuable. And what that means is that the recycling processes have to be that much more efficient, have to be low cost, because you're not going to spend a lot of money recycling when the value of the materials that you're recycling just aren't that high. The other major element that in terms of recycling is also just scrap, the usage of scrap at the processing facilities and at the production facilities. So between scrap and between recycling through 2030, we see a lot of potential for cobalt, less potential for nickel, less potential for lithium. But still, this is meaningful when it comes down to the potential implications of the upstream. And this is also something that a lot of the upstream mining, the main players in this space are thinking about how they want to become involved and how they want to become part of this this chain and web of entities that they're trying to make this happen. I mentioned this also. What are the chemistries of most of the batteries that are going to be recycled? Well, they reflect the changing characteristics of the batteries that have been put in place. As you can see, in terms of the material value, which is the y-axis in the chart here, LFP batteries just aren't worth as much. It's because of what's in them. And that will have an impact going forward on recycling, because, again, it makes sense to recycle and put in the processes to recover the high value materials, not so much for the lower value materials. We'll kind of zip through, I think, some of the other topics, realizing we're a little short on time. But wanted to touch upon iron and steel, partially to, obviously it's absolutely, it's the largest and in terms of the sectors, but also it's one that's had the attention of the emissions and the sustainability community, because it has such a major, such a high level of overall emissions. You can kind of see, and because the choices that are potentially being made, you can see in terms of the usage of processes in order to make steel. The lower emitting processes of electric arc furnaces and DRI are still relatively, they're not the ones that are using the electricity. They're not the ones that are using the coking coal. They're not the ones that are using the natural gas. And if you look at the energy intensity of the technologies in terms of, this is all in terms of tons of oil equivalent per metric ton of coal, you can really see the differences between, where DRI and electric arc furnaces are considerably lower. And this starts playing out when you start thinking about policies like what Europe has put in terms of CBAM, where the iron and steel sector is by far the largest sector that's being impacted by the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So essentially, Europe is looking to protect their own steel makers. They want to put a price of carbon reflecting the carbon intensity of the imports. They want to put that into place. And what this means is essentially that that other countries are also now thinking about, will they also want to put on a carbon intensity mechanisms in terms of being able to protect their own industries. The U.S., surprisingly, is one of, there's a lot of proposals in Congress right now that are looking to put up a carbon board, some measurement of carbon border adjustment. And if you look at what is being potentially impacted, obviously, petroleum products, refined product, natural gas, but aluminum, steel, and coal mining are on the lists of each one of these bills that have been introduced in Congress in the United States. So you think of CBAM as a European effort, in a sense, to put a price on carbon to ensure that their own industries are competitive. It's happening in the United States as well, and it's something that we would look to keep tracking. In terms of how it's done, Europe is still working through this, but the process is at the border. Essentially, there is a fee that would be collected based on the carbon price that Europe is imposing on its own industry. So what you do see is a globalization of that carbon price. Further CBAM mechanisms would also mean a globalization of carbon price, and that would drive implications for production processes, potentially more use of hydrogen, potentially more use of DRI processes, particularly if you can get high value iron ore. I won't go through these in details. I will kind of talk about one last point is how this will work out. I think what we're at S&P, we're working through a lot of the thinking of how does the carbon get reflected in the market? Does it get reflected in through carbon offsets, through the sort of neutralization of the carbon? Will it be treated as a low carbon commodity? We think of crude, there's so many different grades of crude based on their characteristics. Will we have essentially traded values and monetization of low carbon value across the commodities, or will those be trading separately? And then, carbon intensity will impact market valuations. Whether it will be through the need to purchase offsets, whether it will be through the reflection of trading, it will play itself out. We're looking to see how that works out. We're looking to build out all of the different elements to it, and we have many examples already in place. I just took two of them here in terms of Nissan planning to use low carbon CO2 emissions aluminum in its parts. That's going to get monetized. They're going to pay for that. And even, with BHP's offer for Anglo American, it's essentially the ores with high iron content. Those are valued because of their potential use in DRI, which is a lower carbon process. So apologies, I had to run through this in a partially without slides, but hopefully of interest, and happy to to talk. I know we're behind schedule, so happy to talk. Answer any questions afterwards for anybody who's interested. So thank you again.